All right, welcome to the St. Mary's County Library Author Talk with author Olivia Dade. My name is Catherine DeCristofaro. I am a librarian with the St. Mary's County Public Library, and Olivia Dade is, of course, a romance author that we are so excited to talk about. I'm going to give just a little formal introduction. Olivia Dade grew up an undeniable nerd, prone to ignoring the world around her as she read any book she could find. Her favorites, though, were always romance. As an adult, she earned an MA in American history, worked in a variety of jobs that required the donning of actual pants, Colonial Williamsburg interpreter, high school teacher, academic tutor, and of course, librarian. Now, however, she has finally achieved her lifelong goal of wearing pajamas all day as a hermit-like writer and enthusiastic hag. She currently lives outside Stockholm with her delightful family and their ever-burgeoning collection of books. Olivia, we are so excited that you are here today. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us.
Well, I am honored that you asked me. And like I said on Twitter, I am especially excited about chatting with you because I was born in St. Mary's County and lived there till I was 9. And in fact, just visited there again just the beginning of August. And the book that I'm currently editing is set sort of in an analog of St. Mary's County. So I'm very, very happy to talk with you.
Sorry. Thing. So that was going to be a question I was going to ask later. Are you able to give just a little bit of a preview of what your book is going to be about? If you can't totally understand, I know there's.
No, I can. I have written the draft. I am now desperately trying to. It's due like in about a week. I am desperately trying to make the draft shorter because it was usually I don't want to be above about 100,000 words is the upper limit. And this was 121,000 words, so I am trying to trim it back. So the premise of it is it's the beginning of an entirely new series set in a fictional Maryland town called Harlot's Bay, which I
love it already.
And the premise here is that there's a woman named Athena who basically was engaged, and as a wedding present for her husband-to-be, bought the Spite House. I don't know if you know what a Spite House is. If you Google Spite House Boston, it's a house that's built specifically to like inconvenience someone else. And the Boston one has this whole tale with brothers. Anyway, so it's basically like that. It's connected to her fiance's house in a row homes. And so they're going to put the houses together and that's going to be great. Except he dumps her a month before the wedding based on the say-so of his older brother, Matthew. And she has no savings. She already left her job to move to be with him. So really the only place she has to go is the Spite House, which is one wall away from her ex-fiance and a 4-foot gap, an alleyway away from his older brother, who is the one who convinced his younger brother to end the engagement. So that's the premise, and it's her, and the male main character is the older brother, who is, both brothers are pediatricians, and I really love the book, I think, which is hard to tell when you're writing it, but rereading it, I'm really happy with it. Part of what I'm doing in the book is Athena is by far the messiest heroine I've written, a female main character I've written. She is angry and she's sad and she's depressed, and not just, by depressed, I mean like depressed. Like,
clinically depressed.
Yeah, clinically depressed, but does not actually realize it till some point during the book. And I think, you know, I really love her and I really love him. So I'm hoping that, I hope readers will love it too. It's surprisingly funny for a book that has some serious undertones to it. But no, it's my tentative title, which may or may not be kept, is At First Spite.
All of this is wonderful. Well, actually, that kind of leads me into one of my questions. So in your books, you've always featured women who are bigger, who are fat, and who either at the beginning of the story or somewhere along realize that is wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that. But in your heroes, in the spoiler alert series, Alex and Marcus, at least, both have some sort of neurodiversity. So you're also exploring other aspects. So knowing that the heroine in this one has clinical depression, what sort of research or what did you do to make sure that you were portraying that accurately as well? Because I thought both Alex and Marcus were handled beautifully in their descriptions.
So for Marcus, who has dyslexia, that was mostly reading up on it, and specifically actually looking at actors who had dyslexia and how they sort of worked around it, like with scripts and things like that, but also in general, how it would manifest and so forth. And actually one of my child's friends has dyslexia, and so I chatted some with them too. I was a little more intensive, I would say, about Alex, who has ADHD. Because I have a family member with ADHD, I'd actually gone to a bunch of classes about it. But I also, obviously did other research, and I actually ran it past quite a few sensitivity readers, because it is it was central to sort of how he interacts with the world in a way that it wasn't quite as central to Marcus. So Avon actually paid for a sensitivity reader, someone who has ADHD, to check the representation. Also, I had a couple of friends who are openly have ADHD, who were kind enough to read it. Meryl Wilsner and Bryna Starler they both read it to make sure that it was on point. And as far as the depression rep, that is personal experience. So there's a lot of, Athena is not me. I have not bought a spite house or lived just a wall away from a former fiance, but a lot of the stuff with depression is very much true to my experience and the experience of some of my friends.
So can you talk a little bit about how you did come up with the idea for the spoiler alert series, which I feel like I should have mentioned before. Will you tell us, will you remind me when the third book in the series, which I believe is the trilogy, correct?
Yes.
Okay, when does Shipwrecked come out for everyone to be able to purchase?
It comes out November 15th.
Thank you.
And if people are interested in getting it, you may want to think about pre-ordering it from Love's Sweet Arrow, which is a romance-only bookstore in Chicago, because if you do, there's sort of a limited supply option where you get an alternate dust jacket that's like an old school romance cover that's designed by my cover artist, the same cover artist, but Lenny Kaufman, but made it look like an old school 1980s historical romance, like clinch cover, like the breathless description of it. And like between Lenny and the Avon art team, it's incredible. So like it's a dust jacket that would fit the book, but they're only going to print a limited number, and they're going to determine numbers soon, like in the next week or two. So if you think you might want it, you might want to go ahead and order from Love's Sweet Arrow. You can look on my website for more details. It's all on the homepage.
Yeah, Emma just put it in the chat. So
thank you, Emma.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So yes, how did the concept for Spoiler Alert as a series come to be?
I was somewhat preoccupied with fan fiction. For some reason in about 2017, 2018, 2019, I was having a lot of trouble reading books that were traditionally published or self-published. And it was a real loss for me, because reading has always been sort of something I've leaned on my entire life. When I'm troubled or want entertainment, it is my number one hobby and love. And it was distressing that I could no longer sort of lose myself in a story. And around that time, this was toward the final season of Game of Thrones, which you may or may not have heard was not as well received as it might have been. And early though in the season, it looked like there was going to be a happier romantic arc between Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth. Now, I did not watch Game of Thrones. I do not like watching violence, especially sexualized violence. But people posted GIFs on Twitter with the two of them, where he's basically making hard eyes at her. And I was intrigued. I am kind of a GIF whore. And so I was intrigued. And around that same time, Kay Taylor Ray, who's another woman on Twitter, said, if you're into this couple, here are some fanfic options that are good starter options. And I had never read fanfic before. I actually was not entirely clear on what it was, but I started reading some of those. And the second one that she had recommended was by a fanfic writer on AO3, Archive of Our Own, called Astolat. And it's called Traveling Far. And it was incredible. It was very voicey. It was so funny, and it was witty, and it was great. It was as good as anything I had read published. And I was like, this is incredible. I found out later that Astolat is famously Naomi Novik, who like participates in a lot of different fandoms. I mean, but like hugely popular published author Naomi Novik. So
That's
it's not
amazing.
a surprise that like it was really good, but it was a really good entree into fanfic. And so I spent a year and a half reading nothing but Jaime Lannister, Brienne of Tarth fanfic. So when I needed to sort of come up with some story ideas pretty quickly, that the world of fanfic was one that made a lot of sense to me, because it's what I had been doing, not writing. I have never written fanfic, but I had been immersed in reading it for a year and a half.
Okay, which I had a question on here asking you about your history of fanfic, because I just assumed you must be an accomplished fanfic author with how well you seem to know the world.
It is a very specific skill, like to enter into someone else's character that they created, and that character's dynamic with another character or a set of characters, and then try to bring that to life, sometimes in a different setting or a different time period, or it could be a post-apocalyptic zombie thing. It could be a Regency house party. It could be anything, but to take that fundamental central dynamic and keep that while changing, more or less of everything else around it. I mean, it's a huge skill, and it's not a skill I have. I mean, I can do it for my own characters, but other people's, it would take work. And at some point I just decided that I would focus on my own characters as far as writing, but I was really delighted and just stupefied by how the intense creativity of the fanfic community. There are a lot of really excellent writers in around fanfic, but specifically in the Jaime Lannister, Brienne of Tarth fandom. There are some truly excellent writers, most of whom are not professional authors. They just care about their craft, and they care about the characters, and they work to write well and to write good stories, satisfying stories.
So how did you get started as an author then?
I come from an academic background. So I assumed for a very long time that even though I read romances and have since I was way too young to be reading romances, that was not something I could do, that fictional writing was not my strength. But in 2014 was sort of my the first time I was really struggling with depression. And part of the reason that I was struggling was because I was working jobs that did not really require a ton of sort of my writing skill or creativity. They didn't, I mean, they're good jobs, and I cared about my coworkers and cared about doing a good job, but they didn't use good chunks of, a lot of my brain was not being used, and that was very disheartening. And sometime in 2014, I sat down and for whatever reason started writing a scene set in the library, which I was working part-time at the time. And it was not like a full story, it was just a scene, but it felt good. And I think part of the reason it felt good was because it was not necessarily great to be sort of thinking about my own life at that moment. And it was a relief to be in someone else's head in their point of view, talking about their life and their problems. And it also felt good because it was using parts of my brain that I had not used in a long time that I really missed. I always loved writing, even academic writing. And this was using that same part of my brain in a way that felt very satisfying to me. And from there, I wrote an entire book, which will never get published. And then I realized at some point I would need what literary experts call a plot. So I worked on that, and then I started publishing way too early. Like I should have waited longer to publish. My first series, which is out of print, there's some good things about it, but it was clear that I learned to write while writing those books, but that was sort of in the public eye. Not too public an eye. I sold very few copies of those books.
Is that the Love Struck Librarian series?
Mm-hmm.
You should know the St. Mary's County librarians have passed those books around, and we still have them in our collection. If you decided to go back and republish them, we're at least going to buy new updated copies for our collection.
The library content I still enjoy. Obviously there are things that happen in the library that I would not recommend actually having in real libraries, right. But I mean, it was very much based on, my experiences working. I worked at a rural branch and I worked at a central branch. And I mean, that stuff, that content is true to life for my library system at the time. Not the sex though.
No. No. The other stuff, yes, but no sex in the library, please. Okay, let's see. So can you talk a little bit about your writing process when you first come up with an idea all the way until when you are turning in that final draft? How do you approach the process?
What prompts me to sort of decide to write a story can be many different things. Sometimes there's a particular type of character I might want to write. Like I was part of an anthology that is out of print now, although I think most of us have republished our individual stories, called He's Come Undone, where the idea was starchy male main characters sort of getting unraveled. And so I wrote the story Unraveled about Simon as sort of to play with that character, which I hadn't, well, Grant from My Reckless Valentine is close, but not quite. Sometimes 40 Love will probably remain my only book that I plotted out based on the title. I was watching tennis. Before I got into fanfic, I was like obsessively watching tennis. And there was a score in a game that was 40 Love. And I thought that would be an excellent title for a book that was about a 40-year-old. And I was like, well, what story would that be then? And then that's what, came up with an older female main character, younger male main character. Sometimes it's about like the story I just wrote, partly is about my own experience with sort of, before I started writing, I tended to job hop quite a bit, like every 2 to 3 years. And that was sort of one of the sources of, it was a source of anxiety for me for a long time, because I was like, what's wrong with me that after 2 or 3 years I get bored? And my reason is not Athena's reason, but I was sort of depression and sort of that experience, because we're a society, we're a capitalist society where so much of your worth is seen on, is based on productivity. And so if you're someone who is jobless or who can't sort of stick to a job, what does that do to you, as far as your sense of self? And so I wanted to sort of explore that. So my point is, it comes from a lot of different directions, right? But the basic process is, once I have an idea, then I create what I call a story arc, which is like a free form outline. What I do first is sort of look at each of the characters, figure out, I find sort of character inspiration photos, because I'm not great at description unless I have something to look at. So I do that, and that helps too. And then I start thinking about, what's their age? What do they look like? What sort of clothing do they wear? What is their background as far as family? What's their background as far as education? Like, what are sort of the characteristic things about them that will make them individual and unique? And then also, what is something that one of the things about romance is there is the arc of the romance itself, but there also are individual character arcs for if you have a couple, and if it's a female male, then for the female main character and the male main character, if it's two male main characters, and so on. But each of those people often, or should usually, have their own individual character arcs. So then I have to sort of think through, well, first of all, what's keeping these two people apart? There are challenges for different romance subgenres, right? The challenge for paranormal and sci-fi is usually world building, is the big challenge. The challenge for historical, a lot of it is the research, like about how things would have been. But there's a lot of built in with issues of class and so forth, and different sort of different strictures as far as how people interact romantically and sexually. You can put barriers between people. In today's world, there are not necessarily a huge amount of barriers. If you see someone and you like them and they're both single, so I think the big challenge in contemporary is coming up with conflict, what is keeping these people apart? So I have to come up with what is keeping these people apart? Now, in the case of the book that I'm sort of still immersed in because I just finished writing it and I'm editing it, the fact that he broke up her engagement. And if he were to get together with her, you can imagine his brother probably would not be thrilled that, my older brother told me not to marry her, and now.
Right.
Yes. So yes, but sometimes it's more, an internal thing. So there's that. And then you also have to look at what is it that this person needs to sort of learn over the course of this book? What's the thing that is, what about them is going to change over the course of the book? What is, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as their wound, but something that sort of is going to change in their life because of the relationship, but also because of things outside the relationship sometimes that will leave them sort of in a better place at the end of the book for them figuring out. So I do that, and then I start looking at, I start basically going through the main things that will happen in the book. I don't plot out, I'm not going chapter by chapter. Sometimes I'll say they go to dinner and spoiler alert, and this is spoiler alert, I'm going to so April and Marcus go to dinner, and what I had in my basic outline is they go to dinner. She starts out bored as hell because he's pretending to be surface level Marcus, and at some point that changes and she gets interested and sort of figures out that there's some disparities between what he theoretically is supposed to be and what she's seen of him, that he seems actually much more interesting. And then at some point in the dinner that he's got to find out that she is his beta reading partner in the fanfic world, and that he's going to want another date. And so that's what I knew. This is what has to happen. Now, what happens in between all that, all the conversations they're going to have, all of that is something that I come up with as I'm writing it. But I need to know, what is the point of the scene? What are the main things that need to happen? And by the time this sort of scene is done. And I do that for the whole, the whole story. I'm not a pantser. I did that for my first book, the one that will never see the light of day. And it turns out, again, that I'm not good at coming up with a plot on the fly. At some point, 70,000 words into this book, I'm something should probably happen other than banter and sex. And I was I know. There was this super jerk in the first chapter. It was based on, it was set in a Colonial Williamsburg analog, right? And there was a super jerk in the first chapter on one of her tours, which is based on an experience I had. And genuinely, I thought this man, maybe like the closest thing to somewhere I was like, maybe this guy is a psychopath. Anyway, so I was like, he can come back in like there. So like the dude shows back up after 70,000 words out of nowhere and like pushes her down a set of stairs. And I'm like, voila, plot. So, like, plot achieved. So this is why I have to plan things out so that 70,000 words into a book, I'm not like bringing up random dude from chapter 1 and having him push people downstairs. Like, it has to be done. So,
you figured out your process. That's good.
yes. And that is sort of my guide. You know, that's my guide as I write. So sometimes things will change, or I need to clarify certain things. Like I'll think, well, this was his backstory, and I'm like, I'm not sure. But generally, I stick pretty close to the main points of my story arc.
Do you have any characters that are just like your favorite, will live in your heart forever, that you've created?
I would say, well, all of them, almost all of them have a piece of me in it, both male and female characters. I would say, ironically, probably the character that was most fun for me to write is the one that was least like me, and maybe that was freeing in one way, which was Alex from All the Fields, because he is I
love him so much.
I know I'm going to like desperately miss writing him, because his voice, I did not plan him out. In spoiler alert, all I knew is that Marcus, this is one of those things where I was like, Marcus has a BFF, the BFF and Marcus talk about blah, blah, blah. I did not plan out his personality. His personality sort of appeared on the page, which is not something that, like, this is sort of the most that's ever happened to me, I think, while writing. And his personality was so clear to me from the beginning. And I just find him hilarious. Like, I just find him really hilarious. I'm really proud of him as a character, because,
you should be.
Because one of my challenges is making sure that the points of view in the book are distinct, right? Now, it's less true, I think, in spoiler alert, because even though Marcus and April seem very different on the surface, I think interior, part of what the book is about is that at their heart, they're actually quite similar in a lot of ways. So their interior sort of point of view looks more similar than Alex and Lauren, who are completely different people, sort of in how they approach the world. But Alex, I really enjoyed writing, because when I was writing his point of view, there was very little that was generic. Like, everything was he just sounded really unique on the page to me. And I thought he was so funny, and I had fun writing him, and he's nothing like me. And it was really freeing to write someone who is nothing like me. My editor, when I proposed doing, the second book was supposed to be Maria and Peter, the people from Shipwrecked.
Mm-hmm.
That was what I got a contract for. But because the whole thing with Alex became so vivid to me during writing, spoiler alert, I asked my editor if I could write Alex and Lauren's story as the second story. And she's like, oh, I'd forgotten that was not supposed to be the second story. So I got to write that as the second story. Where was I going with this? Oh no. My brain I don't know where I was going.
Hey, everything you've said has been riveting. So, I mean, I'm not mad.
I'm trying to think.
Alex having
it doesn't matter. But basically, Alex came out of nowhere and basically elbowed his way into the second book. I will say that, you know how authors, to get you to read the second book, they introduce the main characters of the second book in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
Sequel bait. It's like sequel baiting. I sequel baited myself, because Alex was not meant to be the second book. This may be the only time in history that an author has done this. I do not know, but I sequel baited myself because I just desperately wanted to write their book, read it after writing, spoiler alert, because he was just so vivid to me.
So was Lauren accidentally sequel baited too? Like, was she already in? Spoiler alert. Really?
Well, yeah, the reason, here's what happened. Okay. So part of what I did in a spoiler alert series is I took as starting points. These books are not about Nikolai Coster-Waldau or Gwendolyn Christie or any of that. I don't know these people. Like, I don't know their lives, whatever. But I took sort of as starting points things about like situations and then sort of spun off of them. So if you looked at interviews of people in the final season of Game of Thrones, the actors, as I've often said, some of those interviews, it looks like impromptu hostage videos. Like, they clearly were like not thrilled about the final season. So I started thinking, well, if you were an actor, you hated the final season of your TV show, you couldn't really say that in person, how would you get that out? So that's what sort of the premise of spoiler alert was. Shipwrecked, if you look at joint interviews of Nikolai Coster-Waldau and Gwendolyn Christie, they banter really well together. They're apparently quite good friends, no more than that. Apparently their spouses and significant others are friends too. Like, it's not romantic, but I sort of like that interaction. And the fact that for a while on Game of Thrones, they were off sort of walking across Westeros together. And I was like, it was just the two of them basically filming together for a season. And I thought, well, you could stretch it out to like 6 years if they were on an island. And like, what if they'd had a one night stand before they ended up there? Anyway, so that's the premise of Shipwrecked. But all the feels came about because if you squint, it is a little bit of an AU of Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth in the ways that the others are not. In the sense that even though Gwendolyn Christie is gorgeous, Brienne of Tarth was supposed to be like not pretty. Like, Brienne of Tarth is supposed to be like ugly, very tall, very muscular. Lauren is not those things. It's a different sort of look, but is very genuinely not supposed to be attractive. And they meet, and she basically has to take, he becomes her prisoner, which is kind of to a somewhat extent what happens with Lauren and Alex, where she is basically given by someone that he hates, like he doesn't hate Catelyn, but like, anyway. And then, yeah, they meet on a battlefield, which was my deliberate homage to that scene. And so this was meant to be sort of my very, 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 if you squint, AU of Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth. The scene at the convention was basically my jumping in the bear pit scene.
You're just making me want to go back and reread all the feels. This is great.
Right. I was just thinking, what is something that was basically like, I mean, dude jumped into the bear pit with one hand and no way out. Like, it was sort of that was meant to be sort of the modern AU equivalent sort of that. There's no twincest though. Everyone keeps their limbs. There's no twincest. But I tried to hit a couple of the things that I really loved about sort of that dynamic, and tried to make it though with entirely different characters.
So I was looking back at some old interviews of yours, and it kept mentioning that the second book was Slow Burn. Was that the original title of All the Feels or the original title of Shipwrecked?
It was the original title of All the Feels.
Okay.
So, but then the title Slow Burn had been used by a few too many books. So Avon wanted to change it. I had some suggestions for things that it could be changed to, and Avon was like, no. I kept trying to, I knew they weren't going to do it. I was like, you know what would be a great title? Down to Fic.
Please write that book.
Or For Fic's Sake. I had a whole series of titles that I was like, and they're like, no. But I was pleased with, I actually came up with All the Feels, because I felt like part of the joy of writing Alex is that he is completely who he is and is unafraid of emotion. He's unafraid of experiencing emotion, whether that is sadness, whether that's anger, whether that's love or joy. Like, he's all in at all times. And so I thought that worked well.
Do you have a favorite heroine, like that you love to the same, if not the same level of Alex, but just a heroine that you really just has a special place in your heart?
That tends to change a lot.
Sure.
I mean, right now I'm I'm sort of in the midst of, with Athena. Sure. And obviously there's a lot in there that, I love about her. Maybe Rose from Teach Me, which is one of my self-published books. It's sort of a lot drawn from my time as a teacher, because I taught high school US history for several years. I really liked her as a character. She's a little bit of an ice queen, and self-protective, but I like her a lot. And I do love, I love all the,
yeah.
It's just that I think part of what makes Alex stand out is because he, again, is nothing like me. And I think that sort of made it a little bit different to write him.
So you mentioned you've done self-publishing and you've done traditional publishing with Avon. Can you talk a little bit about the differences? Do you plan to still work in both worlds?
Yes. So I started out, there was a brief time in romance publishing where they had hybrid sort of publishers, where they did digital first publishing, or EPUB, where they acquired a bunch of authors, did not pay advances, and then spent not much money on the books and released them only really as ebooks. You could only get the paperbacks on print on demand. So it's basically like, in some ways, sort of like assisted self-publishing, right? And that's where I started out. And there's a bunch of my friends who started out that way too. And it did not go super well, which was, they were trying, a lot of publishers at the time were trying to jump on, they watched self-publishing explode, and watched authors, the ones who really captured it, who were able to harness that, made enormous amounts of money, some of them. And they were like, we would like a part of that money, please. And so they tried to sort of capture that, but without, I think, understanding quite what made those self-published authors as successful as they were. And I think there's a reason that very few of those those specific publishing arms of those publishers still exist. They all died several years ago, with a few exceptions. Entangled and Karina, I think, are two of the main exceptions that sort of still exist. So that was somewhat not a great experience in some ways. In some ways it was. They let me write really whatever I wanted, the Love Struck Librarian series, and that was great. But it was not a great experience for other reasons. And so I decided I wanted to sort of take a break from that aspect of things for a while. So I started, but I wanted to keep writing. So I wrote for 2 years, and I didn't really publish anything, but I just sort of stockpiled some manuscripts. And then at some point I was like, you know what, I'm going to give this one more shot. I'm going to try to find a new agent. I'm going to try to find a new publisher, but print or nothing. I'm not doing the EPUB model again. Either I'm going to be on bookstore shelves, or I'm just going to self-publish. That doesn't bother me. So I found a wonderful, my agent, who I adore, Sarah Younger. And all the stuff that I had written for these 2 years, I basically shoved at her. And I said, what if any of this could get a print deal? And several of those things were novellas. And novellas are not going to be in bookstores unless you're if Nora Roberts wrote a novella, it'll be in a bookstore, but I am not Nora Roberts. So we're like, no, not going to do those. And then there were a couple other books like Teach Me, where she's like, it's a really special book, but it's a quiet book. like publishers tend to want books that have more overt conflict and that are sort of more high intensity. And part of what I love about Teach Me is that it is a quieter book, but that's not going to be, she's like, I don't think that it's a good bet for getting a print deal. So basically the books that she did not think were good fits for publishers, I self-published those, which was a great experience actually. And then we took 40 Love actually and tried to shop that, which did not sell, but the spoiler alert was one of my proposed follow-up books. So that is what Avon bought rather than 40 Love. So then I ended up self-publishing 40 Love as well. So that's sort of how I got into the self-publishing. I would love to do it again. I enjoyed, one of the joys of self-publishing is you can write whatever you want, like whatever you want. And that was one of the joys for me of Teach Me, was that it didn't have to be huge conflict. When I wrote 40 Love, there's not a big breakup scene. Like they have a conflict at the end, but there's no big breakup. And that was really nice for me. I hate hurting my characters. My books through Avon, the Spoiler Alert series, literally every book, my editor was like, make them hurt more, Olivia. There is the scene, like the scenes where like they're breaking up. I usually try to keep it a little more like, maybe they will, maybe they won't, like they need to work this out. They're like, no, like, make them hurt. So I don't have to do that quite as much with my self-published books. And I do like writing novellas. I love reading and writing novellas. A lot of readers do not love novellas. They tend to, the price point is lower anyway because they're shorter, but also a lot of readers just don't feel satisfied with the story that's in there. And maybe part of that is craft issues, like if I don't do a good enough job sort of telling the story within that space. But I really love the novellas I've written and I really enjoy writing them. So I will return at some point to self-publishing, but my attention the last few years has gone into the spoiler alert books because they are much more ambitious than the self-published books I'd written, and they just take a lot, they're longer, they take a ton more research, and it just takes a lot more time and energy. So
all right, let's see. So I'm going back, I've been bopping around in my questions. Well, and this is something I feel like, so your books have wonderful fat representation. What work do you do to make sure that that representation is positive and not harmful to readers?
So I would say that my first books with fat main characters were in the Librarian series.
Mm-hmm.
My final book in the series had a female main character who had a history of disordered eating, which I also have. And part of the reason I haven't republished that series is because I did not do a good job with that book. I think it's clear upon rereading it that I had not worked through a lot of things in my own head, so that there were things there that I thought could potentially be harmful for readers to read, even though it was my experience and it was in some ways on the page. That book would need some overhauling. So after that, this 2-year span, I thought very intensively about sort of what I wanted to do. And I had discussions with people within the romance world about that representation. So sort of my own thoughts with other people who had also been thinking about it a lot. At some point in that 2 years, a book came out with that representation that I thought was incredibly harmful. And it was at that point that it was a big name author. It was at that point that I said, out of spite, I'm like, I'm writing nothing but like fat main characters, like fat female main characters from now on, because I thought, I was like, that sucked. This is not what I want in the world. For like, I want to write something that would not hurt for me to read. I mean, that's always sort of the baseline thing is, would this hurt for me to read it? And I think there are a lot of different ways you can do fat representation, some of which are not as much my way. One of the things that I did not want, because I feel like we've seen it too many times, was someone who starts out as self-loathing because of their body, who learns to love themselves during the course of the story. That happens. Again, I have a history of disordered eating. I get it. But like, if that's the main or only representation of fatness you see on the page, it's basically, you're repeating the same story over and over, self-loathing. You're reading these internal monologues where they hate themselves, and it can be damaging. And it makes it sound like the only sort of person who exists, fat person who exists, is a self-loathing fat person until they find love. And then I didn't want to do that. Even the people who have complicated relationships with their bodies, like April loves her body and herself at the beginning of the book. She still has insecurities. Her main challenge is not learning to love herself. Her challenge is setting boundaries. And like, that's what she needs to do in this book, is set boundaries with even the people she loves around issues of her body. It is not her learning to love her body. That's not what it's about. So that was one decision. There are people who don't want there to be any sort of conflicts like surrounding the body. Like I think maybe Talia Hibbert is more, or maybe, no, Rebecca Weatherspoon has specifically said bodies are just never an issue, like larger characters, that just doesn't ever come up as something. I tend to explore a little bit more in some of the books about what it means to go through the world in a larger body, which sometimes means there's a certain amount of fat shaming or fat phobia, or there's certain ways in which the world is not built for people of a certain size. And I explore that a little bit without it becoming, hopefully, like misery porn or something that it's like, something that makes people feel worse about themselves. But I also want to reflect like the real experience of like being a fat person in the world and what that means. And that's not the choice all authors make. And in fact, in the book that I just finished writing, there's actually extremely little in there about like her body. Her body is the least of her issues. Like, she's messy as hell, but like her body and how she feels about her body is like the least of that. So like it barely comes up. So part of my goal for fat representation too is to have main characters with different relationships to their fatness, to sort of be able to explore a panoply of different relationships you can have with your body within fatness, and different body types within fatness, which is because sometimes most fat rep within romance traditionally has been like hourglass figures, and usually female main characters, almost exclusively female main characters. It's only been recently that you see a few male main characters who are fat, like Peter in Shipwrecked. I could name others too if you want me to. But even the female main characters who are fat, which was, again, until recently, few and far between, were almost always described as hourglass shaped and people who would be considered traditionally beautiful if they lost weight. So the only thing stopping them from being traditionally beautiful is that they're larger, but even then it's the idea that they have big breasts, bigger butt or hips, small waist, which at some point I'm like, yeah, there are fat women with smaller waists, but like, yeah, that's not necessarily a typical experience. So I also want to have different body types within fatness. If the people watching want recommendations of books with fat male main characters, Rebecca Weatherspoon, Zenny, especially does that. You have Marie Lipscomb, who's self-published, who does that, and Rachel Lynn Solomon's recent book Weather Girl had a fat male main character. It's not common. Hopefully it will become more common. And then Peter from Shipwrecked is also, from my book, is also fat.
Can you, as a transition there, can you talk a little bit about what people might expect in Shipwrecked, like who Peter and Maria are, just a little bit more?
So the idea here is that Maria is Swedish, and she is basically in her final auditions for a role on this blockbuster fantasy television show, Gods of the Gates, which is what the whole the book series sort of revolves around. And so she's in LA doing chemistry auditions, which is when they get down to like the last few potential candidates for these roles, and they have them act versus each other to sort of see who they have good chemistry with. So down to like the final 2 or 3 people. So she's in LA and she goes to a sauna because she's like, it's supposed to be this Scandinavian style sauna. And she's like, well, let's see what they do. And she runs into Peter, who is an LA actor. And they're immediately attracted. But for Maria, she's very pragmatic about these things. And she sort of feels like if there's no future in this, there's no point in investing more of myself than like the physical part of things, because if she doesn't get the role, she's going back to Sweden. If she does get the role, she's going to be on this desolate Irish island, potentially for years. There is no future with this dude, right? So she hits it and quits it and leaves him without any sort of like, without him even knowing her last name, no contact information. And his feelings are kind of hurt because he really liked her a lot. And of course, because this is a romance, they show up the next day to the chemistry auditions. He didn't even know she was an actor. And they are some of the final people for the roles of Cassia and Cyprian, who are going to be shipwrecked on a deserted island, a desolate Irish island for potentially years, which turns out being 6 years. And they are cast, and then it's incredibly awkward. Then they're on this island together, and it basically follows them for the first year of filming to a point where their relationship sort of reaches a sort of stasis for a while, and then picks up again at the very end of filming when sort of things can really change for them, and then goes from a press junket, which they're partially in Sweden for some of the time, which is really fun to write because that's where I live right now. And yeah, pick up from there. So that's what Shipwrecked is about.
Thank you. I have an arc and it's delightful. I'm very excited that other people will get to read it soon.
Right. I am pleased. I've heard it described as a slow burn with banging on the first page. I started out with like their one night stand, like it's just about done when I pick up the story. I will tell you, I actually wrote the entire, I wrote it out originally from when they meet in the sauna and then wrote the entire sex scene. And there's nothing wrong with this, but like I had no emotional stake in it because they didn't know each other. And like, it felt very hollow to me. And I was like, I didn't want to do it. I felt like there was no point to it. So I went ahead and just started right at the end of the encounter, which was an homage, Jane Ann Krentz.
Mm-hmm.
Right. One of my favorites of her books is it was an old Harlequin Temptation, I think, like from like 92 or something. It's called Lady's Choice. And it starts with them like mid-sex. And basically she thinks he's going to propose at the end. Oh. And he does not propose at the end. And it goes, and so she's like, forget you. And at that point he begins sort of regretting maybe he didn't, and for reasons, because there's like family vengeance and business things or whatever.
Romance reasons.
But I love that story in part because I think her name is Juliana, is like an alpha female main character in a way that was very rare back then, like, and actually I think she's unusual even within Jane Ann Krentz's like sort of body of work. But that's how it starts, is sort of like mid-thrust. And I was like, you know what? There's no reason I can't do that. It's been, it was like in the early 90s. It's been 30 years. Like, I know other people have done it too. It's not like there weren't others. But I think there's like a Kristen Ashley that does it too. But like, I was like, you know what? Let's do this. Let's start there.
Wonderful. So, can I ask, what is the last book that made you join the Bad Decision Book Club? Staying up way too late to read, just could not put it down?
I mean, there are many, but I mean, one of the books that I've most loved in the last year or two is by Mimi Matthews. And she writes historical romance, and it's called The Siren of Sussex. And it's so good. It's really fascinating because Mimi is always great about like research. She's like written stuff about the historical time period and researching the time period, sort of Victorian America. But it's not just that. She's a beautiful writer. So the prose is gorgeous. And in that book, the male main character is not like a duke or anything. He's a tailor, and like not a tailor who's doing great financially. And he is half Indian. So like he's biracial, and as is Mimi. Like, and so part of this was sort of exploring what that means as well, even though it's in Victorian America. So issues of class, issues of race, issues of gender. And the whole premise is that she desperately needs to find a husband because for money, like a rich husband for her family. Like, so she has that financial need. He desperately needs business or else he's going to go under. So he proposes that he can dress her beautifully for these London events so that she can help find, she can find a rich husband, and then he'll get publicity essentially for how beautiful his clothing is. So win-win, unless they fall in love with each other. So, oops. And what's one thing that is so cool about that book is that I read the whole gamut as far as heat levels. It is kisses only, but it is genuinely sexy, like kisses only. It's like, it's really sensual and sexy with not moving past kissing. The way he talks about, he allows sort of her descriptions of how he thinks about dressing her, like how he makes clothing for her, is that the clothing holds her in a way that he can't. So like the way that it touches her and like the fabrics and all of it sort of expresses how he wishes he could touch and hold her. And he expresses that in the clothing. And it's like, it's lovely and it's sexy and it's just really well done. I love that book.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna thank you. I have more questions, but I did promise I would turn it over at least for a little while to our participants. I could just listen to you talk about your writing process and how you approach books and readers all day though. But I do want to give our audience at least a little bit of time to ask. It looks like we have a few, so I might go back.
Okay.
Let's see. I think you kind of answered this, but somebody did ask if your newest book, if that will be fat positive. I'm going to assume yes.
Yes, the female main character. I mean, if it's Shipwrecked, both main characters are fat. And they both are sexy and love their bodies. There are issues that arise because Hollywood and fatness is like external things, although it's not a huge portion of the book. It's not a big portion of the book, but it is, right, they're confident and sexy and both of them are fat. The book that I just finished writing, that I'm working on editing, the female main character is fat as well. And I saw her as like not particularly tall. Like he sort of thinks of her as like a bonbon of a woman, that she's like, more like like an apple shape. But that's not, it is not sort of, her fatness is sort of a minor part of that book, but she is fat.
Yeah. So actually one of the questions kind of relates to something I was going to ask. So they had asked who were you picturing when you mentioned inspiration photos for April and Lauren? And then and they wanted to say, thank you so much for writing Lauren as an apple-shaped fat woman. There's so few of us in literature. And I also kind of wondering if you were to be able to cast your stories, if Hollywood came knocking and said, we want to make this, who would you picture in these roles?
So I guess first, would be about inspiration for April and Lauren. April, was actually, I was looking up, I was Googling like images of like fat redheads. And there was a photography studio that apparently has now closed that had like, they did like classy boudoir shots. And there was a gorgeous fat redhead woman in these boudoir shots with like a tank top and panties on, who just looked really joyful and confident and like was super hot. Like, I mean, and I was like, this, it embodied sort of the spirit of who I wanted April to be, like as far as her body. And so that was my inspiration. I mean, I have the photos, but they weren't mine, so I don't post them, and they're not actually available online anymore, so I can't like give you the link. I'm sorry. As far as Lauren, that was actually much trickier because women who are not traditionally, who are fat and not traditionally attractive with apple shapes don't usually show up like in the public eye, like all that much, like in it, they don't become famous typically on TV or movies. So like it was hard to find a good sort of analog for that. I actually thought of one of my former coworkers who had like a similar body type to that. And I was, for the nose, I was thinking like, for facial features, I sort of thought a little bit about Rachel Dratch. And then, but otherwise, you know, Lauren was sort of an amalgamation of like a few people that I have known. I'm trying to think. As far as casting, like I don't know. You know, I don't know who would be good. I know that like, I've heard for Lauren that probably a good equivalent, what's her name? Like Beanie
Feldman, yeah.
That maybe, even though she's quite pretty, like that, you know, that might be, but I don't know. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer for that. Like whatever you picture in your head, like some people picture like Marcus as like Chris Evans, or I've heard occasionally like Hemsworth or whatever. Whatever you picture in your head is correct.
Excellent. And then this is actually, it's not exactly a question, but somebody just wanted to say how much they appreciated, particularly in spoiler alert series, that being fat is not fetishized. Characters are not loved specifically because they are fat or loved in spite of it. And also, yes, thank you so much for talking about different fat body types. So just wanted you to know how much it meant to this person.
I appreciate that a lot. That's one of my things about, I actually made a video that's on YouTube. If you look on my website, you can find, it's not publicly listed because I just didn't want to deal with it, but it's about fat representation in romance. If you look, it's one of my former blog posts where I talk about making videos, and you can get the link to it there. But one of the things that I talk about was that it is dehumanizing sometimes the way that people talk in books and in real life about fat people. And one ways that is sort of dehumanizing and objectifying is I don't want someone to be loved despite their fatness, because to me that's gross. I mean, I don't want in this case a male main character usually who is like, well, I can overlook the fact that you're fat because I mean, to me, that's not a hero anymore. Like he's not a sympathetic love interest to me. But I also I don't want someone to be desired specifically because they were fat, because that gets into issues of fetishization. And that's also dehumanizing. And like, you can read those stories, but those are like erotica. Right? I mean, that's legit. Like there are people who write and read that, and if you're into that, but like for romance, for me, that was not what I wanted to do, because I think that can be dehumanizing if you're only seen as your fatness. In some ways, you're still not being seen as an entire person, and I didn't want that either. So that was important to me, and I'm glad that came across.
I can totally keep asking you questions, but we've kept you for an hour, Olivia. And if you need to go, I want to let you know we can
No, I saw the listing was for an hour and a half. So I told my family, do not expect to see me. So I'm happy whenever you are ready to end, we end, but
Okay.
I am good for as long as you need.
Well, I'm going to ask you a few more then, because it's just been such a delight to talk to you, and I'm going to keep you longer if you'll let me.
Sure.
So something I always like to ask authors when I talk to them, especially romance, is if you have a favorite trope to read, also one that you like to write, and if they're different, any particular reason.
Above all else, forced proximity is my jam. As is clear, because my unofficial alternate title for Shipwrecked was Only One Island. And like I basically shoved them on a small island together for 6 years. And all the feels basically, you know, because she's his minder, they are together. And that's when I'm reading books. Like there was a discussion on Twitter today about how someone was reading a book and the main couple didn't meet until like 30% into the book. No, no, I can go like maybe 1 chapters, like max 2, and then I'm out. Like they need to meet. Like I want them on the page as much and as soon as possible together, because to me, that's the real joy of it. So yeah, that's my reading and writing. That's my number one. What I have trouble with often is actually like enemies to lovers is very fraught for me, because I think it's a really challenging trope. And I don't think people love reading it, and a lot of people love writing it, but I'm not sure. For me, a lot of times it's very problematic, because while they're still enemies, if anything happens that I wouldn't be able to forgive, then I'm sort of out. Like if I'm like, that would have really hurt my feelings in a way that I would never really forget, then I can't believe in the relationship after that. And that's not true of most people. Most people love enemies to lovers. But for me, there's a very fine line between, I like rivals to lovers, or like professional, like, you know, competing interests to lovers. But like enemies is really hard for me, because unless you tread a really fine line between acting like an enemy, but not being, can I use language?
Oh, please, it's an adult program, sure.
Like if it's a male main character, like not being a dick about it, like I mean, this is like I have, but I am also notoriously merciless, particularly toward male main characters. Like I'm much more forgiving of female main characters. Like if a female character burns down a village, I'm like, I'm sure the village did something to deserve that. If the male main character like swats aside a fly, I'm like, how dare you? I really have double standards, and I know it, but it's just the way it is. So yes. So that for me is always a tricky one. A lot of times books that people love that are enemies to lovers, it makes me so stressed. Like if there's bitterness, like sometimes second chance romances, I have the same issue. If there's a lot of bitterness involved from like whatever happened previously, it's really hard for me to like, it makes me sad and stressed. I can't do it. Even though it's a romance and I know it's going to end well, it doesn't matter.
This might be why I can read your books without getting stressed out, because everything you're saying, I'm like, yes, all of that.
Yes.
So what was your first introduction to romance, if you remember? And is that a book that you could still recommend to readers today?
It was Romances in My Mother's Closet,
Mm-hmm.
from like the early 80s, mostly historical romances. Like she loved like Kathleen Woodiwiss and like Rosemary Rogers. There was at least one of them. No. Consent issues. And like, I mean, I still, obviously I loved it. I kept reading romances, you know, to this day. I think the happy ending was really a huge draw to me, but like there was some, it wasn't even dubcon, like it wasn't dubious consent. It was like lack of consent.
None.
For a lot of it. So no.
That's fair. I appreciate your honesty. So since you can't recommend those, who are the authors that we should all be reading today?
Well, a lot of these people, like, so take this with a grain of salt, right?
Sure.
A lot of these people are my friends, but like, I genuinely really, really love their writing. So, okay.
That has to be an industry hazard. You're going to have, like, how could you not? Yeah, that, I think that's more than fair.
So, three of my dearest friends are three of, I think, super talented authors. There's Emma Barry, who actually has a book called Chick Magnet that's coming out at the beginning of this next year. She is a fantastic writer, and it's like wryly funny, and like, but she's so good. It's the idea is it's like a chicken influencer on YouTube. She's called Chick Nick, and like the grumpy veterinarian who really dislikes, well, he's unwillingly fascinated by the videos and by her, but he hates it because it made a lot of people decide to get chickens who were not prepared to take care of the chickens. And as the veterinarian, then he was sort of brought in to sort of fix things when people did not take care of the chickens the way they should. So like, so we have like hot, grumpy Viking veterinarian and like chicken influencer like in there. And it is really, Emma is really good about, like, his business is failing, and she sort of explores sort of what that means in like a really, I think, thoughtful, it doesn't take away from the romance, but I think it undergirds the romance with a certain amount of sort of reality and emotional like gravity to it. That like there are real things involved, and like her ex has sort of been gaslighting her and what that means for sort of her faith in herself. It's just really, really good. Another one of my dear friends is Mia Sosa, which is, you know, famously for The Worst Best Man and The Wedding Crasher, who I think is like a modern master of the rom-com. Like the way that she writes me, it's hilarious, but also she writes families, like large families and family dynamics really, really well. And also, she thinks, when she writes scenes, she thinks how it would look on screen. Like, would it be funny on screen? And with the way she writes, it's a very visual sort of writing in a way that I cannot do. And like, she's just so good at it. And she's very good at high concept things. Like, she comes up with these ideas and you're like, no, that's like, I want to read that. That sounds amazing. Like the premises for her books are, you know, high concept. I mean, something that you hear and you instantly sort of understand it and want to read it, that it's creative and fascinating. She is extremely good at that. And her books are, again, funny and very, again, she writes family dynamics beautifully. And like, she is, yeah. And my friend Therese Bahari has a book coming out, I think maybe this Tuesday, called A Ghost in Shining Armor. And it's the hero is the male main character is a ghost. So it's like a contemporary romance with some paranormal in it. And Therese is a wonderful writer, again, who is sort of unafraid to sort of deal with the first book in that series. In that series, my brain just went dead as far as the name of it. I know it, but anyway.
You said, so is it the second book?
A Ghost in Shining Armor is the second book. The first book was.
Is it And They Lived Happily Ever After?
And They Lived Happily Ever After. The female main character in there is struggling with anxiety. Like Therese is also quite good at like sort of putting things in there that also give it some emotional gravity as you're reading, and she's very witty. And they're also, I think, really fun to read because they are typically set in South Africa, which is where she's from. And I think that I really love fresh settings in books, and she's giving that. And I love, when I was growing up in the 90s, like all the category romances, they had like ghosts and stuff. Like there were ghost story romances. They had like occasionally paranormal ones. The sort of things that are allowed now, it's very narrowed, a lot of it, like within sort of mainstream contemporary romance. And I love that it's sort of a callback to that. And I think that comes out on Tuesday. So
great, thank you. So going back to almost the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned the clinch cover dust jacket for the Shipwrecked order. Do you get input on your covers and also your audiobook readers?
So I am very fortunate. I will tell you that my first series, the librarian series, I got very little input on the covers. Avon, well, let me backtrack. One of my other agent sisters is Alexis Daria. And if you look at Alexis Daria's covers for Avon, there you have Me and Ola, a lot like Adios. They are amazing. They fit like sort of the Latinx sort of, it's beautiful and distinct and perfect for the book. And Alexis is the one who suggested that artist to Avon. So we have the same agent, Sarah Younger. And so when we got to that point in my contract, Sarah sort of gave me the heads up, and she's like, if you're going to want input about this, you need to do your research, because we were able to like suggest someone for Alexis's book. So be ready. Like, if you want to give input, you need to be ready. So they did. They actually asked me, like, do you have someone in mind? And by that point, I had spent many hours. What I did was I started researching just what covers I loved. I knew it was going to be an illustrated cover. I knew I wanted an illustrated cover that leaned toward the more realistic. Like, I wanted them to have faces. Like, I wanted, in part because it was important to me to have particularly someone who is overtly fat on the cover, where it was not just like a blob person in the distance. Like, I wanted them right there in front, delineated sharply enough so that there was no getting around it, or like not seeing that that person was fat. And then I saw that Lenny Kaufman had done the cover for Mimi Grace's Along for the Ride, I think it was. Yeah, Along for the Ride, which I loved. And it had like a style that I really adored. And then I went to her website and I looked at her other work, and I saw that she had people with different, like diverse bodies and diverse like drawings, because there are some artists whose aesthetic for the covers, like they only draw like tall, thin people. And I'll be frank, there are illustrators out there, I run into them, where if you ask them to draw someone who is fat, they don't know how to make fat bodies beautiful, either because they've never been taught to, or maybe because they don't find fat bodies beautiful. And so you have to be, I wanted to have someone who I trusted to make larger bodies beautiful. And so, and without fetishizing, without minimizing, you know, the same thing I did in my story, I wanted to be on the cover. So I found Lenny and I asked them if they would be willing to do, you know, to get her. And I was fortunate enough that they said yes. And I was able to, like, I put together, like, each book, I put together like a cover dossier of like, here's what they look like, here are my character inspiration photos, here's some of the clothing that they wear during the book, here are some possible settings from the book. And then, you know, here, if I have an idea as far as poses, then I'll mention that there. And then basically these books, I just let Lenny go to town on because she's so good. Like, my main note I had for this one was that I wanted it to be hot, because the thing with the illustrated covers, which I love, is that they tend to be more cute than hot. And I was like, I would like some like heat. Like, could we try to make this like, again, hotter? So I was like, I want more of a clinch cover. And so that's what they did. I loved all the covers. I love all the covers. Shipwrecked to me is just like pitch perfect. I love how it came out. And that's really fortunate. The audiobook covers, I mean, the ones that I've had thus far, they basically, you know, most of it has been Avon, so they just use the same covers. And my self-published ones that are in audiobook, they used my Lenny Kaufman. I love Lenny's stuff so much that I used her for my self-published books too. And so they just use those covers, and why wouldn't they? Because they're gorgeous and brilliant.
And then for the readers for audiobooks, do you get any say on that, or is that what you meant by you just use the ones at Avon?
So as far as like my narrator, yes, for my Avon books, usually they give me a limited sort of like, here are 3 or 4 people, which of these, tell me in order, like which ones because people may or may not be available. On my self-published books, I ended up, something similar happened. And one of the narrators was Kelsey Navarro. And she was by far like my #1 narrator. And she did my Marysburg series. And so when I had a chance with Avon, I was like, her tone is very wry. Like, it's not like a cutesy tone. It's very like, to me, it read well, I thought, with the sort of people that I write and the characters I write. I think she's incredibly good at what she does. So I've tried since then to try to stick with Kelsey as much as possible. I think that she's great.
Well, Olivia, thank you. I cannot tell you how wonderful it has been to hear you talk about your own books and how you've been writing and characters. And somebody did put in, I'm going to ask the last question we have here from audience. Somebody asked if you had ever thought about writing any queer romances.
Well, the first thing I would say is that one of the bonuses for pre-ordering, if you register on either, if you look at my website, it'll give all the details, but if you register on one of the landing pages, either Avon or me, depending on how you pre-order, one of the bonuses is a exclusive story with Summer and Kara, who are side characters from Gods of the Gates from the series. The reason that I do not write more queer romance is because I am cis, mostly het, and I have enough of a platform now that I would take oxygen from like people who are like somewhere, LGBTQIA+. I don't want to, I want their room to be publishing the ecosystem for them to tell their stories. Publishers, and I say this lovingly because I love my publisher, are much more likely to publish white people who publish with BIPOC characters than they are to publish BIPOC authors. They are more likely in some cases to publish straight women like me writing queer characters than sometimes that they might be publishing queer authors. So I don't feel like, I don't want to intrude onto that, but I always make sure side characters, a lot of them, that there's a lot of LGBTQIA side characters, and I do my best to use my platform to to advocate for queer authors, for who write LGBTQIA characters. So I mean that's important to me, and hopefully that's what I do. It's the same way I feel about, again, writing main characters of color. That's changed for me over time, because when I started out, I was like, I want to look like the world around me. So of course I'm going to have Black main characters, or, a Latino hero or whatever. At some point I was like, I'm taking up space that should be given to people who actually are not white. And my goal is to help them find their audience, and to make sure that the universes that my characters are in are diverse universes.
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful answer. I appreciate that. So thank you everyone who attended today. Thank you again, Olivia. This was such a lovely conversation. Olivia, is there anything else that you just haven't had a chance to promote, or anything that you wanted to share? Because again, just go read her books. We have them at the library, go buy them. Just such wonderful stories that I think everyone should read. And yes, I'm sorry. Yes, is there anything else that you would want us to know about?
No, again, Shipwrecked is November 15th, and I really love the story. I made a lot of Sweden jokes. There's some ABBA references in there. So if that is entertaining to you, then go for it. I love it, and if you get it, I hope you love it too.
Is the name that Maria continues to call Peter throughout, is that an actual insult?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I feel like Shipwrecked breaks exciting new ground when it comes to the endearment. I mean, I'll just tell you, this isn't really much of a spoiler, is that Maria's sort of endearment for Peter throughout the book is, Swedes have a word called wheat stubble, and it means shit boot. So Maria's term of endearment for Peter throughout much of the book is wheat stubble, shit boot. Much of it, which I feel like is exciting because, you know, a lot of books have like babe or like sweetie or honey. Like, I feel like, you know, shit boot is underused.
And now we've heard you pronounce it, so when we're reading it, because I was definitely saying it wrong in my head. So
yes, yeah, it's wheat is the beginning. It looks like skit, but it's wheat.
But thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful afternoon if you are here in the United States, and evening if you're in Sweden.
Yep, it is 9:30 in the evening here. Yep.
Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. That's so kind of you.
It was delightful. Thank you to everyone who is listening. Thank you for asking me, Catherine. And, you know, I hope all is well in your corner of the world, wherever you are.